Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to make sure your cell phones have been turned off. Thank you, Bruce, since there are two. We, of course, will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference, and our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program today is Bruce Klingner, who is our Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia in our Asian Studies Center. He has 20 years' experience in the intelligence community working at the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency. Before joining Heritage, he spent several years at the Eurasia Group, a global risk assessment firm, as its primary Korea analyst. And he also worked as Director of Analysis and Senior Asia Analyst at the Intellibridge Corporation. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Bruce Klingner. Bruce?
Thanks very much, and I will be very careful not to touch any buttons. All right. Well, welcome to the Heritage Foundation. We're glad you could make it, and I'm glad we had such a good turnout. It's my pleasure today to host my colleague, Bruce Bennett, for a discussion about his recent study. And for those of you who don't know Bruce, he's a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corp, where he specializes in strategy formulation, force requirements, and responding to asymmetric threats such as weapons of mass destruction. He's also very well known as an expert on Northeast Asian military issues, having visited the region 90 times or so, and he's written very often about Korean security issues. And those of you who follow Asia will be very familiar with his very long list of publications, including a recent study he did before this one with Jennifer Lind of Dartmouth, where we talked about sort of manning the staffing levels that would be required for a North Korean collapse. So I think that probably served as a foundation for this study. So North Korea collapse really is an overwhelming topic, I think, because it's both in terms of the enormity of the necessary preparations for dealing with that situation, as well as the consequences of getting it wrong. And so what Bruce has done is delineated the many, many facets of that issue in what I think is a very structured, very logical manner. And so his latest study that he'll talk about today is preparing for the possibility of a North Korean collapse. And it really is the most comprehensive study I think I've seen on the topic, and I've been reading them for a number of years. And what I think is really good is he lays out and explains the reasons why North Korea could collapse in great detail, very convincingly. And he also talks about the potential consequences of a collapse and the need to prepare for it. And that's, I think, the main thrust of the study. And that he also argues very convincingly that neither the United States nor the Republic of Korea are terribly well prepared for it right now, particularly as the South Korean military continues to downsize the size of its force and its ground forces. So now some might be put off by the size of the report. I think nowadays we tend to want our analysis in bite-sized, tweetable chunks of 140 characters or less. But I think it really should serve as a manual for both the U.S. and the South Korean governments. And even the table of contents, if you read that, really provides an excellent framework in itself of how to prepare for collapse. And in his book, he acknowledges the previous studies that have provided a foundation for his book. But what I found quite new, amongst other things, was how he addressed topics such as overcoming the North Korean mindset, the mindset that's just inculcated into their mind right from birth almost, and then also how to deliver humanitarian assistance even when Allied forces don't have complete control of the peninsula. So his study has gained a lot of media attention, and I think a lot of mischaracterizations where the media depicts him as predicting the imminent collapse of North Korea. But if you look at the title, it's preparing for the possibility of a North Korean collapse and not preparing for the North Korean collapse, which is just around the corner. So please join me in welcoming Bruce for his study here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bruce, and for your kind words in particular. When you talk about North Korean collapse, people have been talking about this for several decades. And so some may wonder, well, why raise the subject now? Why look at it now? After all, it hasn't happened, and so Maybe North Korea is stable enough that it won't happen. The issue, it seems to me, is one that in North Korea there are a variety of sources of instability. None of those sources are sufficient to completely cause the overthrow of the government. But they raise the question that at any time we could potentially see a change. After all, if you were in Germany in 1985, who predicted that within 5 years you would see the change in Germany? I don't know of anybody who did. And we don't know with North Korea. It could be unlikely next week. It could be 20 years or 30 years from now that there's a change. It may even be a peaceful unification. But for whatever of those, we need a variety of kinds of preparation, and many of those are the same whether it's a collapse or a peaceful unification. What I'm going to do is to talk, though, today about the collapse kind of case, why it might exist, and what kinds of consequences that could lead to, and finally, what we ought to be trying to do to mitigate those consequences, because quite truthfully, I don't think we want those consequences to develop in any way, shape, or form. So let me start with a quote from one of my colleagues, General Sharp, who was the commander in Korea, and he made this quote 3 years ago, just about the time he was leaving the command. And he talked about North Korea in the following kind of way. He said, "Combined with the country's disastrous centralized economy, dilapidated industrial sector, insufficient agricultural base, malnourished military and populace, and developing nuclear programs, the possibility of a sudden leadership change in the North could be destabilizing and unpredictable." Now, as Bruce said, I'm not predicting that collapse is imminently going to occur. What I am trying to argue is we need to be imminently preparing for such a thing. There are bases of instability in the North, and as I'll talk about in a minute, we don't know how those are going to develop, but we had better pay attention to trying to be prepared to deal with them. So let me go forward here and say, as you think about North Korea, you have to recognize that there is a hierarchy of leadership in North Korea, a hierarchy of people. Kim Jong-un now is the leader of the country, having taken over from his father almost 2 years ago. And below him there is a second tier of leadership which we know a whole lot less about. But they're there. Traditionally, the Kim family has been very careful with that second tier of leadership, not to let anybody get too powerful. They have tried to balance them. Because obviously, if you let anybody in that second tier get too powerful, you've created an individual who could potentially carry out a coup against you. And then you get all sorts of other layers of leadership, the senior leadership, the military, and so forth. My argument is we don't know what would be the basis for a collapse. But it could be as simple as the fact that Kim Jong-un simply is assassinated. One bullet could make all the difference. We're not talking about something that requires an Arab Spring of people gathering together and so forth. If he is gone, the likelihood that that second tier of leadership is able to come up with a unified decision on the subsequent leader is, I would argue, not high. After all, he's not designated a successor, as in the case of his father, who didn't want to designate a successor until very late in his life. That's not a great thing to do in that kind of a dictatorship. And he's maintained balance there. It is likely that many of those people in that second tier really don't like each other and would be competing with each other. Now, maybe somebody could take over and form a new government, and you would not have a government collapse, just a regime collapse. But that was not the topic of my study. The topic of my study was what happens if that leadership fractures, and we see different factions occur. I'm showing on the chart here 2. It could be 3 or 4 or more. And if those factions develop, then we have to recognize that over time they will spread throughout the rest of the leadership and even among the people. And the government will likely divide. And if you think about this kind of situation, if it really develops in this way, the likelihood of a civil war between the factions, each trying to take control and establish themselves as the leader of the whole country, is pretty likely. And let me step back and say there are also other reasons for civil war. North Korea can barely feed their people today with substantial external aid. And if all of a sudden there is a government collapse, much of the vehicles for feeding people will go away, and people will hoard food. If you're not familiar with it, in 2009 there was a government currency revaluation in North Korea. And what happened was people held on to food as a way of holding wealth in that situation because they were limited in the money they could exchange into the new currency. And in a period of 2 months, the price of food went up 1,000% in just 2 months. Similarly, if you find yourself in a government collapse, an even more fundamental problematic situation, it is quite likely that people won't release the food they have control of, and therefore you will see starvation and a real humanitarian disaster in the country. That is something I think we would want to avert, but which we're not very well prepared to do so today. If that situation develops, the military may well get out of control even within the areas of the individual factions, because even today the military doesn't eat all that well. In fact, there are stories of starvation even in the military. And as that situation develops with civil war, it may well be that South Korea decides that it needs to intervene in the north, and the U.S. as an ally to South Korea supports our ally and intervenes along with it. Now, that would be important, and we'll talk about why that would be necessary. But of course, the other situation to recognize is China may also intervene. In fact, I think there's increasing evidence that China would intervene. I've been to 3 different conferences in South Korea this year with fairly senior Chinese personnel speaking. And in each case, they talked about Chinese intervention into a collapsed situation, talked about the parameters and what they would think about it. So it's no longer a we don't talk about it kind of subject. It is actually out there and starting to be discussed. The other thing to think about that kind of situation is if you have a civil war, A, it will likely spill over a little bit into China, a little bit into South Korea. B, if we are intervening, the North Korean military is roughly 3 times the size, active duty, of what we faced in Iraq in 2003. A much bigger military force. Their reserves are 10 times the size. And this is a force which is very determined and very capable. In particular, there are some 200,000 special forces in the north. So the basis for an insurgency is already created. Many of the military personnel are already involved in the black market and would find criminal activity as probably the key alternative if there's no longer a centralized government available. And oh, by the way, the North Korean military also has weapons of mass destruction. This appears not to just be a rumor and a possibility as in Iraq, but fairly good evidence that North Korea does, as in the fact that they are testing nuclear weapons. And many of the projections show that they may have, for example, by 2016, not just 1 or 2, but potentially dozens of nuclear weapons, which would really change the circumstances. So this would be a very different environment from what we've experienced before. The size of North Korea in terms of total population, the size of the country, not all that dissimilar from Iraq in 2003, but the challenge is potentially much greater. Now, having said that, a lot of people focus on a collapse leading to the unification of the country, which is my key assumption in the study, as saying, well, of course the problem is dilapidated economy, infrastructure needing repair, got to rebuild the economy. The GDP per capita is in South Korea, what, 10, 15, 20 times as big as in North Korea? So will people stay at home in the north? According to the Bank of Korea, they're projecting that if there's a collapse, there would be 3 million refugees who would try to cross into South Korea. Can you imagine 3 million people coming into South Korea? Low jobs, and so they would bust unions, not having housing, not having the other infrastructure required. And so there are potentially serious costs there in the long term. But I would argue the short-term costs are also daunting. Again, trying to deal with humanitarian disaster, civil war, a big military that will need to be demilitarized. 1.2 million men in active duty service in North Korea is the normal estimate. You can't afford to maintain that very long with both the resources it takes away from the economy and the cost, but many other issues here that would have to be addressed. It's no surprise as a result that many in South Korea are increasingly reluctant to see a collapse and subsequent unification. And yet in many ways, that's the ultimate of Korea, I think one would argue, that eventually you would want to see the country unified. Are you really satisfied with the current North Korean leadership and how they treat their people? Starvation, lack of medicine, people thrown into gulags, is that really the future of that country that you want to see? It's not the future I would like to see. But if you're going to change it, you also have medium-term issues. In East Germany, there were tremendous issues over property rights. People who had owned property before the division of Germany, who tried to take control of it after unification and take it away from the people who were living on the property and, in a sense, owning it, even though the state owned the property in East Germany. You have even more serious concerns about that kind of thing with regard to North Korea. Many people in South Korea having deeds to property in the north, holding on to them, hoping this is going to be a substantial cause of wealth for them. This is an issue which needs to be addressed. You have a variety of others, criminal prosecution. How many people in North Korea have been guilty of bribery, guilty of more serious crimes? What, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million? I mean, bribery is rampant in the country, either receiving it or doing it. South Korea has a prison population of 45,000 people, roughly speaking, and a judicial system designed to handle that size. There is no way that they could deal with the huge criminal population, quote unquote, that might exist in the north. There's going to have to be some decisions about what you will press and what you will not. And likely much better to do that before this kind of event happens than after. So what are the total consequences then? I start talking about humanitarian disaster, about warfare. They potentially involve into major damage into the north. I mean, the north may face a dilapidated condition now, but you have warfare that goes on in the north for any period of time, and things will only get worse. Worsened humanitarian disaster, in part because of food being swallowed up, problems with instability, and of course refugees being a constant concern. The Chinese don't want refugees, and they're very clear about that. They already have 2 million ethnic Koreans in the China border area. And it is an area with an economy which is in not good shape, can't sustain what they want to now in a good manner. And so massive refugees going to China is no more acceptable than massive refugees going into the south. And if we don't handle these things well, the North Koreans become disaffected. They start migrating into insurgency or other criminal activities. In addition, as this develops, you've got issues with weapons of mass destruction. You've got damage that could bleed over into South Korea and, oh, by the way, also China, potentially. And responses to all of that. And then, of course, you've got the issue of China intervening and potentially playing a role in the peninsula and maybe deciding that they don't want unification to occur. We don't know what the Chinese would take as an objective. And if indeed they do, we could have a race for Pyongyang that looks like the race for Berlin at the end of World War II. And the problem with that kind of thing is when our military forces, ROC and US, run into Chinese military forces, will they shake hands? Or will there be a more violent interaction? And even if that only happens once or twice or three times, could that escalate into a war between South Korea and the United States versus China? A war none of us want, because it would be truly devastating in its impact. So those are some of the consequences. What can we do to try to mitigate them? Let me turn to humanitarian aid first. This map is based upon the North Korean 2008 census, the most recent one done. It looks at the distribution of the population. It's important to note that in that census there are about 9 million population in the coastal counties of North Korea. And then as you go into the interior, a relatively small population south of Pyongyang, a large population around Pyongyang and further north. This is important as you think about humanitarian aid. Most people who think about humanitarian aid say, oh, we'll let the international humanitarian organizations handle that. They'll get the food in there just fine. The problem with that, of course, is, sure, they can deliver it to the ports, but who's going to take the food from there? The North Korean military, the North Korean black market will likely wind up with most of it. The people you want it to go to will not. If you don't provide military escorts, you're not going to get the aid directed to where you want to, and you won't be able to stabilize the situation in the north to cut down on the civil war occurrences, the other things that are being perpetrated by the military. So we think of a military intervention and we think of the army forces crossing the DMZ and going into the north. The problem is the area they'll likely go into doesn't have a lot of population. You're not going to be taking care of the population very well. And simply them crossing over the DMZ, they will rapidly consume the road space available. There's just not a lot of transportation available. So we propose in the study that we look at having US and South Korean Marine forces be assigned to try to get aid ashore in the coastal areas. Now this will be attractive in terms of the fact that North Korea has relatively few ports, especially on the west coast. You can't just deliver aid to the ports and hope that that handles the situation. In many cases, you will have to take aid across the beach to get it to the people. And Marines can do that. They're designed to do that. They haven't prepared to do that, but they could. In addition, you're eventually going to have to think about bringing aid in by air into the interior areas. You think of the Berlin airlift from the Cold War era, but in this case, there are not a lot of airfields in that area. Some of that aid would have to be airdropped. And if you think about the quantities you might get involved with to break the hoarding of food, we may well have to provide, in terms of aid, close to the daily consumption level of North Korea, about 15,000 tons of food a day. Half of that would potentially have to be delivered by air, just to give an example. That's about 135 C-17 sorties. Just to put that in context, we have what, 120 C-17s? That would be very difficult to do. Now you could also deliver by C-135 or C-130s, but that takes about 500 of them to deliver that. And we would be hard-pressed to come up with that number of sorties a day as well. What about the military in North Korea? We can't afford to leave the military armed and potentially dangerous as we start moving through the country delivering humanitarian aid. And there are two typical ways we discuss in the literature about demilitarizing that force. The first is called civil reintegration. Basically what happened in Iraq in 2003. You tell the soldiers, thank you very much, you're no longer a soldier. If we can, we'll take your arms away from you. And you're a civilian now, go home, good luck finding a job. And this is not an environment where you're going to have a lot of jobs, given that you don't have really adequate jobs in North Korea to start with. So that's not a great alternative. It doesn't provide much security. What happened in Iraq? Well, a lot of those soldiers became insurgents because they didn't have another thing to do. Go into criminal activity in North Korea. Another alternative is to simply bring them into a combined Korean military. That has its advantages in the short term. The challenge is, will you really trust those soldiers if you leave them with weapons? Won't some of them pose some serious danger to the unification, if that's what you do? So I propose in the book a third alternative, where in some ways is similar to the second. We keep the military in the military, but we disarm them. And I refer to this as public service. If you look at North Korea, for example, North Korea has about 25,000 kilometers of roads, according to the CIA World Factbook, about 700 of which are paved. If we need to run humanitarian aid into North Korea, into the interior of the country, we're going to tear up those roads that are unpaved. And so why don't we take the military forces, disarm them, and then tell a battalion of soldiers, about 500 or 600 soldiers, Commander, this 3 kilometers of road is your job. You go out and you fix that 3 kilometers and you keep it in great shape. We're going to pay you to do that. You do a good job, we'll give you a bonus. We're going to teach you about how to live in Western society. We want you to learn the skills of dealing with roads. And over time, as we can, we will bring in paving equipment and let you pave that road and potentially beyond. Because we want you to learn job skills that will allow you to go into the private economy. And over time, we will transition you there. But why leave them in the military? Several important reasons. One, you want to respect the positions that they've owned. If you tell the elites in North Korea, we're taking away your positions, then they're likely to rebel against you. They're not likely to support a unification. Number two, you don't want to stop your debriefing of these people once you've gotten them disarmed. You want the ability to go back and ask them questions, find out what they've been doing, find out where weapons may be stored and so forth. And you want them under military discipline in doing that. You don't want them deserting and going off again into criminal activities or insurgency. And military discipline, they understand the implications of that. You also want to apply things like biometrics that we learned about in Iraq and Afghanistan, which helps you then track down people who do decide to go into criminal or insurgent activities. So that's the idea. Keep them in the military to keep them employed, and then over time transition them out, but don't keep them as an armed force. What about other issues? Weapons of mass destruction is a big issue. According to the South Korean Defense White Paper, North Korea has 2,500 to 5,000 tons of chemical weapons. That's somewhere between 2.5 and 5 times what we're saying is in Syria. So it's a very large amount, potentially. We don't know for sure. North Korea does a great job of hiding that information. They may have potentially already 10, 20 nuclear weapons, biological weapons. We don't want those being used, and we don't want them proliferated. And especially from a U.S. perspective, if those get proliferated to terrorist groups, those terrorist groups would be focusing on us as a target in many cases. So we want to police them up. We want to go to the storage and production facilities and collect them up. That's a task that will be a big task because there are many such storage facilities, we believe. We want to go and deal with the experts. There may be, as I suggest here, 15,000, 20,000 experts we need to deal with. And I'm not just talking about the senior scientists. There are technicians in that program who know specific details of these weapons that we don't want going to Iran or other countries to help them develop their programs. We also want to stop the proliferation activities. A black market economy will try as best it can to ship these things out of ports or airfields or across the border into China in order to get them to terrorist or other nation-state groups. We want to stop that activity. But all of this will take force to be able to monitor these things and control it. Now, I've drawn on this chart a curve which is notional, but it says if we were to try to do unification today, tomorrow, next week, South Korea today has 22 divisions of active duty ground forces. But even with that 22 divisions, there's some chance we could fail to stabilize North Korea. It's not a big chance, but we could. There's some risk there. But the problem is that South Korea faces tremendous demographic problems. South Korea has a 1.2 births per woman per lifetime rate right now. And you know when you have that kind of rate, you're not going to replicate your population, but in particular, the size of the age group turning conscription age is going down substantially. That group was about 400,000 up to about 10 years ago, young men turning 20 every year. Now the number is down around 350,000. By 2020, 2022, the number will be down around 300,000. By 2025, the number will be just a little bit above 200,000. And why is that important? South Korea drafts almost all of its young people. The vast majority of young men serve in the military. The military is currently 75% conscripts. So if you cut down the pool of conscripts, you're going to cut down the size of the military. South Korea has a defense reform plan, which is their medium to long-term modernization plan. And in it, they specify that by 2022, they're going to be down around 12 to 14 Army divisions, almost all of the reduction in force coming out of the ROK Army. I think that if you have a 12 to 14 division force of the ROK Army, you're not going to be able to stabilize all of North Korea, even with U.S. help, given the opposition force. The probability just crashes down somewhere above that. Now, there are cases where we might be able to handle it if we do adequate preparations beforehand. But we're headed in a direction which is dangerous. What would we do in that case? The only choice I can see is to turn to China and ask for Chinese help in that stabilization. And the people in South Korea aren't going to want to do that. But that is the alternative that I think will be the option unless we make better preparation for using military force. Now you might say, well, why not just use South Korean reserves? They've got lots of reserve forces. South Korean reserves train a maximum of 3 days a year. So let me ask you, your favorite football team, your favorite baseball team, you're going to limit them to training 3 days a year. How are they going to perform in their sport? Similarly with soldiers, if you train 3 days a year, you might be able to pull the trigger on a rifle, but you're not going to go into North Korea and be an effective force in stabilizing the country and dealing with the other challenges. So changes are needed in the military that I describe in the book. Let me move on to China. Many people have hoped for years that if this kind of collapse or other conflict occurred in Korea, China would not come into the north. But there's been nothing done by either the South Korean or U.S. forces to prepare to prevent China from coming in. And as I said, China doesn't want the refugees that would likely flood to their border looking for food, just as they did in the famine in the 1990s. So we need to be prepared to deal with that kind of situation. And again, as I said earlier, in conferences, I'm increasingly hearing Chinese talking about, well, of course we would cross the border. We would need a buffer zone. It would be 50 or 100 kilometers deep. And oh, by the way, Yongbyon, the nuclear plant in North Korea, is roughly 100 kilometers from the border. They interestingly say the reason they would come into the north would be to deal with refugees and ... weapons of mass destruction in North Korea. because China worries about them as well. So China may come in, and our question becomes one of, so what do we do? Now, the natural inclination of South Korea is going to be to say, gee, I'm not anxious to run into North Korea. I know this is going to be very costly. Maybe things will sort out in the North as this collapse is going on so that I don't have to go in and intervene. But the more we delay, the more opportunity we give the Chinese to seize territory and maybe go beyond an initial buffer zone. There may indeed be a race for Pyongyang. If that happens, and hopefully we can develop cooperation with China so that it doesn't, then we are going to need to try to prevent a war with China. One way to prevent a war is what we did with the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. We drew a line across Germany and we said, east of that line, that's Soviet territory, west of that line, that's US and Great Britain and France. That is a truly miserable option. But I would argue that war with China, a nuclear country, is an even more miserable option that we have to avert at almost any cost in this case because of the damage that could be done. One Chinese nuclear weapon going off in Seoul, and South Korea will no longer be a 21st century country. I mean, that's the reality. The economy, the people affected, and so forth. We can't take that risk. Let me conclude by talking about the North Koreans. One of the earliest pieces we need to do in terms of preparing for a collapse is to convince the North Koreans that there is life after unification. After all, North Korean propaganda tells them there is not. And this is just one example of apparently the kind of propaganda going on. Kim Jong-il reportedly sent people into East Germany to film what had happened to the East German elites. And they were careful to choose those elites who wound up with miserable lives after unification in East Germany, and to bring those films back and to show the elites in North Korea that this is what happens if you allow Western unification. And so as a result, many of the elites in North Korea think, whoa, this is not even something I want to take on. This is an issue we have to consider. And you might think, well, but, are they really going to believe this? Let me ask you a different question. Assume you are a senior leader in North Korea, maybe a 4-star general, somebody in that senior leadership. If I were in that position, I would ask, well, gee, what has South Korea done with their former presidents? How have they treated those presidents? Well, let's see, they've thrown them in jail. They've taken them to court. They've threatened to do even more severe action. And 2 presidents ago, he committed suicide after he left office. Why would I, as a North Korean, believe that I would be treated better than former South Korean presidents, given all of the rhetoric that's gone on between the countries? That is a situation which I believe we have to change. We have to make it appear that there's going to be selective amnesty. We're not going to throw those people into prison unless they've committed really horrendous crimes. In practice, as I argued earlier, we don't have the capacity to do it. In addition, though, we need to take many other actions to convince them that there's a good life after unification. So let me talk about some things you could do. South Korea needs a South Korea is a great country campaign, I believe. Something that would bleed over into North Korea. Something where you could say, if you're in South Korea, this is what a supermarket looks like. This is what people shopping in the supermarket are collecting up. This is what a hospital in South Korea looks like. Gee, we have antibiotics. You don't in your hospitals, but you don't have to say the latter part. North Koreans know that. You want to go to a university in South Korea? Most anybody can go to a university. In North Korea, only the privileged few get to. You want to do interesting scientific research? Let me tell you about what we're doing in South Korea. It's really great. And oh, by the way, we have 23 nuclear power plants in South Korea. Not one that's so radiated it's a trap that will kill people, like the Yongbyon reactor. So we need to start with that kind of message. Go on to say, if you're a merchant, we want you. This is part of South Korean culture. In North Korea, merchants are thrown in jail occasionally, at least, if not more often. They're not supposed to be out there as merchants. And so we ought to be emphasizing that difference. And then going on to many other issues about treating defectors well, people living well after unification, even the military, but then also highlighting some of the differences. Hello. Up. Okay. Let's see. I want to come down here. Yep.
It wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you. All right, we will go back. There we go. Got it. We got it. We also have to highlight the failures of the regime and make people develop a more realistic view of what's going on. I just give you one simple example. Why aren't we saying we know that the North Korean military is starving in many places? Their people are having disease and so forth because they're not eating adequately. And yet the regime reportedly has $4 billion in overseas bank accounts. Why is it that they're not using that money to provide food even to the military? That's a disconnect which suggests some of the problems with the way the country runs. I don't think Kim Jong-un would want us saying things like that. But we need to make clear that there is not a unification in the leadership in the North. People are being victimized at all levels. Let me conclude by saying we don't want the consequences I talked about earlier to happen. If we have unification, collapse and then unification without properly preparing, the outcome could be really bad. We need to be preparing for it, and the key to that preparation is for the U.S. and South Korea to work together. This is an area where we can cooperate, we're close allies, we should be trying to support each other. And there are many things that I recommend in detail in the book I don't have time to talk about here, where we could make progress in these areas in order to try to be ready for this occasion. Again, I don't know anybody who predicted the timing of the German unification. Don't know anybody who got it right. We don't know what's the detail of the situation is in the North. There's already been one assassination attempt reported in November of last year against Kim Jong-un. We don't know if there have been more, maybe. And if you look at the security guards he puts around him, here's a substantial upgrade of his security force compared to what his father used. So I think there are reasons for concern. But I'm not predicting imminent collapse. It could happen any time in the next 10, 20, 30 years. In fact, it will take us 10 or 20 years to adequately prepare, to change the mindsets of people, to have the food and other things ready to be able to take care of the situation as it develops. And so that's why I argue preparation needs to begin imminently. Even though collapse may not be imminent, probably won't be. But we need to be preparing now. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. I'm going to take the prerogative of the host and ask the first question.
Sure.
Picking up a point you said before, is that South Korea is increasingly reluctant to see or to want collapse and unification, and the polls show decreasing support for unification. Now it's barely a majority, and certainly the younger generation is least supportive. They tend to see North Korea as a different country rather than the northern half of their country. So, and Lee Myung-bak's unification tax didn't have a great deal of support. And, so how is your message received in South Korea? Are they saying, my God, that's great, we really need, you've convinced us we need to prepare, or is it, no, especially if you say it could be decades away, they don't have to prepare?
Mm-hmm. I think the key that I was hoping with the book was to start the conversation like that. In South Korea, I don't see a lot of conversation about specifics of unification, what would happen, what we need to do to deal with it, and so forth. There is this, well, there may be a high cost in terms of economic costs, but not a lot of discussion of the nature. I think we need to be talking about that because, quite truthfully, I think South Korea will be reluctant to deal with a collapse in North Korea until the Chinese cross the border into North Korea. And I think at that stage, Korean nationalism will probably compel a Korean intervention into the North, a South Korean intervention. Can't tell for sure. But I think there are conditions that would develop that would drive that sort of thing, regardless of the financial cases, in reality. If there's any chance that that's the case, I'd like to be better prepared than less. And again, my purpose in writing the book is to get the discussion started. If the South Koreans want to conclude that they don't want to do it, that's their choice. That's their choice as a country. But they need to talk about it before they make that conclusion, rather than just sort of push it off because, hey, it was expensive in Germany, so we don't want to do it.
All right, the floor is open for questions. If you could, once Bruce picks you, identify your by name and organization if you have one.
Please.
Yeah, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. Thanks for your comments. I've been thinking about it. I couldn't help get out of my mind the idea of what's been happening in the Middle East, in Libya and in Syria, and the whole idea of knowing what's happening or whether anybody's going to intervene.
Yeah.
It seems to me increasingly risky, uncertain for everybody, and that the idea that even South Korea would want to intervene, and the U.S. would run after them, it seems to make no sense. We've given our own capabilities, and the fact that we, despite the tilt to Asia, there's no really removal from the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
How does this factor into your thinking about?
Sure. And I think there's a reasonable possibility of the direction you suggest. But let me suggest, I suggested the one case of once China crosses the border. I think the more compelling case goes back to a conversation that Kim Il-sung generated in 1993. This is reported in the Foreign Policy Journal in 2008. One of Kim Jong-il's tutors defected and reported this event. Kim Il-sung in 1993 was facing the first nuclear crisis. And he asked his generals, if we have to fight the Americans, will we win? And of course they're all, oh yeah, we'll win, we'll win. He then asked, if we lose, what do we do? And a collapse for the regime is a loss. Kim Jong-il reportedly spoke up and said, if we lose, I will destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? I think there is a reasonable probability that if we get this split, civil war won't just occur within North Korea. They have missiles which reach well beyond North Korea. And they may well take either retaliatory measures or simply end of the world kind of measures against many of the countries around them. The first weapon, the first missile that goes off of that sort, I think will tend to compel an intervention, especially if it's nuclear tipped. I don't think we'll face much of a choice. So I think there are several events which could occur where, even though we are reluctant, even though we would really rather not do it, we may feel forced to do it. The South Koreans in particular may feel forced to do it because of the threat that they face if they don't do it. Maybe that you don't have that situation developed, that it doesn't happen. I'd be a little surprised. I'm not just going on the basis of talking with or of reading the story in Foreign Policy. I actually got together with some senior defectors in South Korea, asked a former senior foreign ministry fellow whether or not that story was true, and he said, oh yeah, it was. So there's at least a logic within the society in the North which could lead to a really compelling notion for intervention. Doesn't guarantee we would do it, but the risk we would take if we didn't could be very high. Please.
Shin Suk Lee of NBC TV, South Korea. It seems that the United States has changed its North Korea policy in the direction of detainment instead of engaging. The six-party talks for denuclearizing North Korea has stalled right now. In the meantime, North Korea is improving its intercontinental capabilities, and also recently we hear that it has restarted Yongbyon nuclear facilities. Do you think the detainment policy is going to be successful instead of engaging it? It seems that North Korea for now seem to think that it will live happily ever after with the status quo. So far you have talked about the possibility of North Korea's collapse, but that's after North Korea collapsed. But right now, do you think the U.S. detainment policy is going to be successful? Thank you.
Well, the U.S. policy comes from a perspective, as I understand it, of saying, why should we be negotiating if all we do is give them things and they don't follow up on their side? And so the U.S. position recently has been, show us an evidence that you're prepared to denuclearize, and we'll go back to the six-party talks. I should note, though, that if you look at the public opinion polls in South Korea, the one that I saw that occurred right after the third nuclear test, 90% of South Koreans said they do not expect North Korea to ever give up its nuclear weapons. You know, if there's not a chance they're going to give them up, then either we change the basis for our negotiations, which is no longer denuclearization but something short of that, or there's not a lot of reason for negotiating. I think, though, there you have to say, what has North Korea done? We've been very clear, show us a sign that you're sincere. What did they do? They started back up the Yongbyon nuclear plant. That's 180 degrees out from what it is they would do to show that they were sincere. The U.S. has been a little vague on what we've asked. My position is we should tell North Korea, if you're serious about denuclearization, take one nuclear weapon and give it to the IAEA. Just one. Give it up to the IAEA and show that you're prepared to denuclearize. It's only one weapon. It's not your whole force. I think that would be a good signal that they are serious. If they aren't prepared to do that or something serious like that, then we need to change our approach to negotiating or simply abandon it. We're not going to be successful. Now, I would not discount, however, President Park's trust politic. I think it's very important to have some discussions going with the North. I mean, the discussions that went on between East and West Germany were a key preparation for German unification. I think that's important, but I'm not awfully confident that we're going to get a lot out of it. I mean, look at the Kaesong industrial complex. The North makes all kinds of commitments, and now they're starting to back off from them yet one more time. So the North is not creating a condition of trust. And I think that's the problem in trying to negotiate. Still think we ought to try. But politically, can the U.S. president go into negotiations with the North Koreans and give them lots of stuff and have nothing in return? Politically, a president can't do that. And we don't see President Park either saying, let's go back to the six-party talks, I think for similar reasons. So, please.
Adam Brickley, I work here at Heritage. We've talked about China, the U.S., and South Korea, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether the other big player that has some security interests in that region, which would be Japan, will have a role in this, especially as they are constructing a more independent foreign policy, especially on national security issues.
Yes. Well, first thing to know is that South Korea has always been very clear that if there was a war with North Korea, Japanese forces are not invited in. So the force role is not going to occur, with one potential exception. We're going to see a tremendous flow of boat people out of North Korea if there's a collapse. I think the help of the Japanese Navy in policing them up and maybe in securing the coastline. I mean, North Korean submarines may also go out to sea to cause whatever havoc they can cause. So some help of that sort outside of North Korean territory may be welcome. Our South Korean allies have to decide on that. But I think the place where Japan really can help is with regard to things like humanitarian aid, with regard to helping finance the whole process of stabilizing the country. In the end, a unified Korea may appear economically challenging to Japan, but in reality, they could be a great trading partner and really help Japan with its economy stuck currently. So I think if one looks on the positive side, Japanese help to at least the economic unification and some selected security areas would be very important. Please.
Hi, I'm Olivia Enos. I'm a research assistant at the Heritage Foundation. Independently of Heritage, a couple of friends and I have been working to found a nonprofit organization that's focused on kind of providing a cushion for the people of North Korea should the regime fall. So my question is, you talked a lot about assimilation and education issues. How can we work to create assimilation and provide education for current defectors, both in South Korea and here in the United States, so that we can kind of model for future generations how it's going to look like for them practically once they do get out of North Korea?
Mm-hmm. Well, you have a challenge with defectors in South Korea today. There's over 20,000 defectors in South Korea. Many of them aren't doing terribly well. And that's not a great example to be setting for the people in the North. I think there needs to be more attention to how do we make the defectors look like an exemplary population that the North Korean people will feel comfortable with. That's challenging. Those people, generally speaking, don't have good educations. They have difficulty finding really good jobs. I mean, they wind up with not very good jobs. There's just a lot that needs to be done to think about that, but all of that involves money. And that's going to be a key part of trying to deal with that situation. I think setting the example is the most important thing that could be done. If you've read some of the books about North Korea, the Nothing to Envy book, about a medical doctor who came to South Korea as a defector. And she was told, you've got to go back to medical school. You don't understand modern medicine because you were trained in North Korea and you don't understand how medicine works. I would think we would want to take people like that and provide them a one-year course or something like that and not put them back to the beginning of medical school as just an example. But again, it takes money to set up that kind of thing, to facilitate it. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be looking at so that we set a good example. A question in the back?
Hi, how are you? Mike Samarov, U.S. Marine Corps. I was engaged in a discussion once at a certain place about this particular topic, and my interlocutor presented a very contrarian point of view that I'd be interested in your response. In essence, he said, well, actually, maintaining the Kim regime, as despicable as it is frankly in everybody's best interest. I mean, you outlined all of the bad things that occur, possibly clash between U.S. and China. He made a couple of other interesting points, said that, the cost, you mentioned that. East Germany, by the mid-last decade, had cost all of Germany together to rehabilitate something in the neighborhood of 3 trillion euro, and they were continuing to pay about 10 or 11 billion euro a year to continue rehabilitation. Nobody's got that kind of money. From the Japanese perspective, it keeps the U.S. present in a third country, thereby potentially helping it against China. The Chinese don't want to deal with the refugee situation, so on and so forth. So perhaps isn't the best situation for us then, as much as we hate to say it and as much as the people of North Korea are suffering, is to keep them incarcerated through this bizarre regime?
It's an important trade-off to think about. I would argue that, first of all, that's what China's trying to do right now. But notice that China is keeping North Korea on life support. They're not rebuilding the industry, they're not paving roads, they're not improving, with some minor exceptions for their own economic interests. And that's likely not going to solve the problems. So this is not just a case of people living miserable lives. Their clock's ticking. The power distribution system in North Korea, sooner or later, it's going to fail. And when it fails, the already terrible situation with regard to power is only going to be much worse. Unless some of that infrastructure gets fixed and so forth, the whole set of events could happen very naturally. And, you know, whether or not Kim Jong-un is shot at some point in time, and there were lots of stories of his father suffering assassination attempts, especially in 94 and 95 and 96, right after he took over. We may not be able to control that. We may have to deal with it in any case. Keeping it on life support isn't going to be an adequate solution unless we're prepared to go in and fix a lot of the things in the North. And that's very difficult to do with the North acting the way it does. Sooner or later, it could well come apart. And we have to be prepared to deal with that, I would argue. Question?
Hi, I'm Kelly McLean from Jubilee Campaign. My question is in relation to the gulags and the political prisoners. But as we prepare for the collapse, how do we take those in consideration? Because they are also preparing for a possible collapse. And as we've seen, you know, like with the Nazis and such, how do we prepare for them preparing to destroy evidence as well as people and things like that?
Yeah. I actually addressed that in the book. And the concern there, of course, is that many of the camp guards, they've committed horrendous acts. No matter whether you offer any kind of selective amnesty, they're not going to get it. And so they may well try to destroy the evidence, kill the people, essentially. That means that those facilities have to be a high priority in terms of places we go. And we're going to have to go there with military forces to be able to deal with it. Interestingly, one of the camps, Camp 14, the one in the book, it's what, about 15 kilometers south of Yongbyon? So if you're headed up towards the nuclear plant, it's right on the way. So places we're going to want to go will include both that and the weapons of mass destruction. There's some synergy there. The problem is we're going to have to send in adequate forces to deal with that. We're going to have to understand the nature of the camps, the nature of the people there, numbers and so forth. So we send adequate forces to prevent the killing. But we better be prepared to get there pretty quickly. And that may mean going in by air assault, by heliborne insertion, airborne insertion, at some risk. But it seems to me that that's something, and we have to recognize these are not just prisoners. Many of these people are former high officials. They may be absolutely key to helping set up the government in the local areas and beyond after unification. They may be very helpful in that process. There are people who know all sorts of things, which is why they're in the gulag, because the regime doesn't want that information to get out. So this is not just a humanitarian issue, it's also a leadership issue.
We did it all? All right, well, thank you very much. Bruce, please join. Great. Well, I think we had a very good discussion, and I commend all of you to read the book. It's fascinating in the actually the breadth of the discussion and the topics that Bruce covers, as well as the depth of it. So it really is a truly remarkable book. So anyway, thank you all for joining us, and have a nice day.